In this series of conversations, we'll be discussing global food sustainability with guests who bring a deep understanding of the environmental and cultural challenges facing our society, and creative ideas on how to address them. I'm Ash Sweeting, and welcome to the Ash Cloud. Today we are joined by Mary Shelman, the former Director of Agribusiness at Harvard Business School and a thought leader in global food sustainability. Mary also led the creation and implementation of Origin Green, the world's only national food sustainability program based out of Ireland. I welcome Mary to discuss how we can inspire people to address some of our crucial food system challenges.
So I think the one thing I would come back to at the end, this is the most important industry in the world. There's without a doubt, right? And I think the thing that we don't do enough is to make that case for our young people that you today are so concerned about climate. And something like 70% of them suffer from something called eco-anxiety. They're so concerned about, the world that like 1 in 4 of them say that they're not going to have children because they think that the world's going to be a much worse place tomorrow, in the future than it is today.
Farms are much more than food production systems. How do we identify and then value all the impacts of farms on our society and environment?
How do we get farmers to think about, not just thinking about, what is my yield per acre or per animal, but how do you think about it on an enterprise basis, right? What's the value of the fence row? What's the value of, the creek that runs through my farm in Kentucky and the forests that are there that I have? So we talk about, is food not valued enough? The other piece that's not valued enough are these ecosystem services that farms and farming offers.
The existing paradigms need to be reevaluated.
But you think about the US, right, and maybe the world, there's a message out there that says fresh is best. But when you think about that fresh is best, you're automatically putting waste into the system, right? Because if you freeze it the minute it comes out of the field, if you can it the minute it comes out of the field, we know, especially with frozen, that you actually have a higher nutrient content.
There's a lot we can learn from the past, especially about waste.
For generations and generations, and nothing went to waste, right? And you look today at our luxuriousness. When I would go visit them on the farm, there was never any waste because whatever you didn't eat was taken out. It was either fed to the hogs as slop and turned back into food again, or it was fed to the dogs and the cats. So we used to have this really nice circular economy, kind of pig production in China, right? A couple of pigs in the backyard, they kept your house warm because, maybe they were underneath you in the wintertime.
Is a strategy of low-cost food the best approach? And is cheap food sufficiently valued?
You can either be low cost, you can be differentiated. And kind of thinking about that's kind of the challenge in front of the food system right now, right? Do you have this strategy to where you have low cost products that are, affordable and accessible and nutritious, and you can get nutrition to the masses, not just in the US, but all around the world, and bring it out? Or do you have this maybe a more luxurious strategy of premium products that have, more sustainability attributes into it?
Continuing along the current path may soon no longer be an option. Business as usual is likely to be an open invitation for increasing regulation.
We don't meet our climate commitments, you're going to be legislated out of business, right? You're going to lose your license to operate, which is the scariest thing to me now. If we don't have these conversations that I'm talking about, that if we don't act as a more coordinated industry level to be able to say, this is our plan, this is why it's relevant, and this is what's going to happen and why it's so important. We look at what's going on with New Zealand and dairy. We look at what's going on in Netherlands with the pork industry, with Denmark with the pork industry. I mean, these are countries that are kind of legislating their way, regulating their way out of things that have been very important to their economies. And what ends up happening then is that you're actually, pushing production to someplace else in the world of where the environmental footprint is worse.
Currently, There's no globally accepted definition of sustainability. What are we actually talking about with sustainable food?
When we talk about sustainability, do we talk about a sustainable farm? Do we talk about sustainable agriculture? Do we talk about a sustainable food? Or a sustainable food system? Saying you're sustainable today isn't enough. You actually need to be able to prove it. So you need some data to back it up, other than the fact that you've managed to hang on and maybe grow your operation and things like that.
The challenges are complex and difficult. The value of cooperation and persistence should not be underestimated.
First of all, there's no silver bullet answer to it, right? So this was an activation process that took 2 years, from basically the conception idea to launch. When we first started talking about that shared vision, we were basically laughed out of the room by the CEOs of these food companies. And by the time we went through this 2-year process of, putting this program in place, it went from, wow, this will never happen, right? We can't agree with anybody, right? We're used to competing in global markets, not working together, to, oh my goodness, why couldn't we have this sooner?
We cannot underestimate the link between our food systems and our health.
What is it that really matters? Is food valuable? Yes, but nutrition is more valuable than food, perhaps. The cost in the US today, certainly in my home state of Kentucky, to treat illnesses that are related to poor dietary choices is huge.
It's vital to think of the big picture.
One of the most insightful comments I've ever heard about farming came when I was visiting a good friend of mine in New Zealand, and she was professor at Massey University, but also she and her husband have what I would have described as a dairy farm. And I was with them, and she said, no, Mary, it's like, we're not dairy farmers. Our job in New Zealand as farmers is to grow grass. Our job is to grow the best crop of grass we can ever grow. And then we make a processing decision. What do we want to turn that grass into? Do we want to turn it into into milk production? Do we want to turn it into, beef, into sheep, into, venison? And I just thought that if you kind of focus on that fundamental, we want from this soil, this precious, soil and resources we have, to do the best that we can with it, right? And if you're thinking about your job as growing grass, maybe you move that herd in a different rotation, right? In order to keep that grass, right, to where it comes back again.
Mary, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Ash. I'm looking forward to it.
So in our societies, we have some different conversations going on in the rural space, in the food and ag space, compared to what's going on within the more urban societies in terms of how they see sustainability, but also how they see the priorities in terms of sustainability. And at the end of the day, we live on one planet, so everyone needs to be on the same page. And if we can all be addressing the problems together, that's going to be more beneficial. So how do you see, I guess, those two conversations and how they vary, and then ways we can build bridges between those urban people, which are essentially the market for all that food that's being produced, and the farmers who are producing the food?
Yeah, I feel like, I've spent my last 35 years or so in Boston, but, grew up in Kentucky, very much part of more of a rural economy. My dad was a local farm equipment dealer, and I was always going out with him to the local farms. And, you're so right. I think it's you've got kind of this rural urban divide, but you also have this kind of, in the US at least, and kind of this East Coast, West Coast versus middle of the US divide as well. And then we get into the issues around sustainability. One, where the biggest challenges, I think, is there's no definition of it that is globally accepted. And in some ways it's a moving target, right? Because when, kind of it popped up on the, people's agendas, maybe, more seriously for the first time back, right, in, 2007, 2008, at least related to food, with, the big spike in global food prices, and, at the same time we had this global recession going on, and so we had some critical events. It's like, oh wow, there's maybe tension in the system, and maybe looking out to the future, we have bigger population, they're eating different things, a limited set of natural resources to push, to promote, to produce those with. So a lot of it, the early conversations were around the environment, and clearly that's still an important part, but then we kind of wrapped into that, right? Animal welfare, child labor, treatment of workers, human health. And it's just, so when we look at these conversations now, people are, they can kind of find the one dimension they like and push on it. And maybe leave the others. And so for a number of years, I've been asking this question about, when we talk about sustainability, do we talk about a sustainable farm? Do we talk about sustainable agriculture? Do we talk about a sustainable food, or a sustainable food system? And kind of depending on your lens there, you get different sets of, answers. And I think that's a big challenge. But so many of the the farmers that I've talked to over the years, I mean, they always start with, of course we're sustainable, right? We this, particularly if it's a family farm, we've been here for a long time, we're still here today, and we want to make sure that it's going forward into the future. And but my challenge to them, or my question to them, is saying you're sustainable today isn't enough. You actually need to be able to prove it. So you need some data to back it up, other than the fact that you've managed to hang on and maybe grow your operation and things like that. But kind of getting into that question about, how can we maybe help enable those conversations? The first point that I always say when we're talking about this subject is that consumers, the answer is usually we need to educate consumers. And it's like, well, that's great, but consumers don't want to be educated. You push back on that, right? Consumers, they want to engage now. They think they're empowered. So, how do we do that? We can invite them into our operations. We can actually show them how things are done, kind of give them that lens. The second piece of it is that you have to start young, like really young. I think about, kind of the youth today. I went to a conference back in May, and I listened to an author speak, and she had written a book about kind of taking, kind of green steps one at a time. And she cited the fact that like that youth today are so concerned about climate. We think they're on social media, that they're talking about, boys or movies or whatever, and they're actually talking about, these kind of big social issues. And something like 70% of them suffer from something called eco-anxiety. They're so concerned about, the world, that like 1 in 4 of them say that they're not going to have children because they think that the world's going to be a much worse place tomorrow, in the future than it is today. I think that's very sad, but we have to, but that just says that we need to start early. Maybe the answer is like 4th grade, not even, high school. And, I love the idea of things like, community gardens, gardens at school, anything that you can actually allow someone who's not been involved in agriculture to go out and realize the challenges that come with actually trying to grow something and to produce food that you eat at the end of it. So I think there's a number of, ways to go about this, but what you've talked about is a huge issue.
I think there are 2 very interesting points you made there. One is urban people needing to educate farmers, or farmers needing to educate the city folk. And most of us hate being told you must do this or you're wrong about your thinking. I think there's enough evidence, be that within the US or within our broader geopolitical situations, that is not a road to success. So how you actually establish those conversations, so it's not educating but more sharing experiences. And it was another thing that happened to me last year. I was actually at Harvard Medical School for meeting with a professor there in the longevity space, and there were some younger guys there, and the topic of a mentor or mentorship came up. And actually what was discussed is that everyone of our generation should have a mentor that's under 25. And so, make us more in touch with the younger people and hearing their voices and stuff like that. So I think there's some fascinating angles there. Is there anything you have to add to that?
Yeah, Ash, that last piece of it about a mentor is, for us is, I think that's really important because it's easy, just like our parents and grandparents, poo-pooed what we did when we were young. The music was bad, the work ethic was bad, everything was, bad. And then, we get to that spot that, we're also saying those things. So we need to see, I think, the brilliance and the passion of the of this younger generation and figure out how to harness it in a way that actually can help us solve these problems. I think that's the way you get engagement, is that you say, hey, we realize, that we've all got a big job to do. Let's work together to do this. You guys are the future here. But they need models of success, right? They need stories that show that we've, Malthus back in the 60s, right? Said, the world's going to not be able to support itself. And then you have the Green Revolution, right? So technology is a huge piece of these solutions. So how do you, get into these, bring it into these conversations about, kind of reinventing the food system, evolving the food system, transforming the food system, as opposed to like creatively, we have to destroy the food system and build it back again, which is, kind of scary to think about, because we have done a tremendous job. And even the numbers, kind of before the latest go around with the, the economic situation right now and the war in Ukraine, about, the progress that we had made on a global level about, pulling people out of poverty, but also getting access to better diets is significant. And nobody tells that story, right? Nobody and that means that you don't have any hope for the future if you never hear about the progress that was made in the past. The second piece of it, I think, is something that I heard at another panel I was moderating, and it turned so how do you, engage with this, this kind of younger generation that, do things like, they do like, e-gaming as a major in university now. So, esports, like, what is it? How can you have a major in esports? And then, I heard that the U.S. dairy industry is working with this influencer by the name of Mr. Beast. And I don't have anybody in my household really that, that's kind of in that Mr. Beast generation. But I talked to some other people, some other parents, and I'm like, oh man, we know about Mr. Beast. Turns out Mr. Beast, has like 114 million subscribers to his YouTube channel. And his the videos on that YouTube channel had like 20 billion views.
Wow.
I mean, it's just a staggering number, right? And then I heard that the dairy industry is actually working with Mr. Beast, to get him to, to promote dairy in some ways, as being part of a healthy diet. It's like, that's how you reach a group, is you find the, what's important to them or the voices that they do listen to, and you bring those people on to your side. Now, I know Mr. Beast also has promoted some things that may be contrary to what we would like in the industry, maybe, kind of, plant-based milks and other things like that. But, you need to understand that that's an important channel, and we need to be part of these new conversations, right? As opposed to, with the traditional, media approaches that we might be thinking about.
Yeah, so many points come to mind with what you've said there. I think one, it's a broad conversation. There's 8 billion of us now on the planet. There's not all of us have the same choices or the same desires or ambitions or tastes. So I don't think, we need to be, and I think social media has probably played into a certain amount that's kind of sent us more into these silos. And in many ways, we need to be speaking to people who we might not agree with, or at least might not agree with on anyone, because, find avenues to broaden those conversations rather than go to that comfortable place where we feel, our views are mirrored.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's so I've spent a number of years at Harvard Business School, right? And the very simple answers. I'm fascinated by strategy. I've always been fascinated by how businesses work and business strategy. And and what they teach you at Harvard Business School is really two simple answers. Companies can have, industries can have, two strategies, right? You can either be low cost, you can be differentiated. And kind of thinking about that's kind of the challenge in front of the food system right now, right? Do you have this strategy to where you have low cost products that are, affordable and accessible and nutritious, and you can get nutrition to the masses, not just in the US, but all around the world, and bring it out? Or do you have this maybe a more luxurious strategy of premium products that have, more sustainability attributes into it, built into it, certainly important to do. But sometimes they lead in a way that then pulls up everything else. And the folks that maybe need the nutrition the most, are then kind of blocked out and maybe off to less nutritious products. I think about the, debate around cage-free eggs is the one that comes to mind to me, right off. It's funny, way back in 1995, I was at a conference in Paris, and this is early days of the CAP. And there was someone from Australia there that stood up in the audience, and he said, "I just can't understand why a strategy of cheap food can ever be wrong." And you can see that now, maybe today, that you can't go all the way in that direction, because there are certainly unintended consequences around it. But yet, it's a fascinating discussion, right? Whether who it is you're trying to satisfy, because people have different needs and a different willingness to pay. Europe has made choices, that put them in that high price camp. But then you look at where some of their production comes from, and it comes from, areas of the world like, Brazil, some, yeah, that others that are, maybe not being exploited, but maybe are exploiting in a different way their resources than if you were a European consumer feeling like you're, very virtuous. Then maybe if you look at that total footprint, it might not be as virtuous as you expected it to be.
That's very, very interesting, especially the bit that you mentioned about the cheap food. And my mother and her parents, they left Eastern Europe directly after the Second World War and moved to Australia as refugees. And they had lived through the Second World War in Europe, and they had a very different attitude to wasting food than many of my contemporaries today. And I guess if things are cheap, do we value them enough? And that's kind of my lens on that. But is cheap food actually, obviously affordable food's different to cheap food, and we have income variation. So what's affordable to one demographic is not affordable to another one, but that's different to cheap. And is food not valued enough is the question I'm digging at.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, my parents too, and my grandparents before them, living through the Depression, both sides of the family, on farms, always in farming, but too poor to actually own land, back in Kentucky, for generations and generations. And, nothing went to waste, right? And you look today at our luxuriousness, I think about it actually in the sense that, when I would go visit them on the farm, there was never any waste, because whatever you didn't eat was taken out. It was either fed to the hogs as slop and turned back into food again, or it was fed to the dogs and the cats. And, and now you look at it, we can't even do that anymore, because, the veterinary industry and the pet food industry has turned itself into saying, oh, no, you can't feed your pet's table scraps. So we used to have this really nice circular economy, kind of pig production in China, right? A couple of pigs in the backyard, they kept your house warm because, maybe they were underneath you in the wintertime. And, and again, your table scraps go down. It's like your bank is there because, you're capturing it, and then to take them to market. And so a little bit is, have we, caught ourselves, kind of valuing things in different ways. The other piece I think about in the US, a little bit off topic here, but along that area of, have we kind of led ourselves down a path is that, so my relatives grew up on farms and they had huge gardens. So the women spent basically all of their effort, in the summertime, kind of growing food and then canning food or freezing food or, whatever it took to get through the winter there. So, I meet all these, kind of younger people who have this romantic view about having a garden out back and, canning your own food. And I'm like, no way. I saw that growing up. This is like, we're talking about moving hot baths of tomatoes, in cans, off the stove in a kitchen, the size of a postage stamp, and it's 97,000 degrees inside. I want nothing to do with it. But you think about the US, right? And maybe the world, there's a message out there that says fresh is best. But when you think about that fresh is best, you're automatically putting waste into the system, right? Because if you freeze it the minute it comes out of the field, if you can it the minute it comes out of the field, we know, especially with frozen, that you actually have a higher nutrient content. But yet the produce industry, I think, has done quite a good job about convincing us that, if you don't eat fresh fruits and vegetables every day, then, you're not getting the nutrition you need. And yet you think about how much of it goes bad in our refrigerators, not to mention the supply chain, but, in the US, I think in a lot of developed places, right, it happens at the refrigerator. It's like, man, I don't know what to do with this, right? I don't want to eat leftovers again. We ended up, eating out 4 times this week. So that lettuce that I bought or the pepper or whatever, it just gets tossed in the trash, the avocado. And again, it's what goes back to what you said about kind of not valuing it enough, and then maybe not having the skills or the need to like take care of that and, have another meal at home that you've already kind of had. So,
or as well as that, like you mentioned, the traditional recycling mechanisms, where essentially livestock, be they chickens, be they hogs or pigs or even ruminants, that basically not only recycle the actual food by creating more food, but then put the nutrients back into the soil or back into your vegetable garden.
It's funny, kind of thinking about that piece of it. I know we were talking about that kind of that balance now, right, that was promoted by COVID, that big question in the world, right? We had a very efficient global supply chain for many things, right? But food was one of those. Food travels great distances. You might argue that that's bad from a mile standpoint, but from a comparative advantage standpoint, if you're in Brazil and you have lots of land and water, then you can produce soy, or you can produce beef and move it around, and basically you're moving water around the world that to some place that doesn't have it, but yet on the other hand, so we saw during COVID, right, empty store shelves and this big, starting to be these questions like, should the food system be efficient or should it be resilient? And I go back to my engineering curriculum. So I'm an engineer by training, not that I've ever practiced, but I had my senior class in process design, reactor design for chemical engineering. It's like, okay, you have to do this, process, purification process, what types of vessels do you need? What does it look like? And, and you go and you work it all off. And I went in and took it to the professor, and he looked at me and he said, "That's great, Mary. Now go add 20% to your design." And I'm like, well, what do you mean 20%? Because this is the right answer, right? The numbers are perfect. He said, that's the real world factor. It's the fact that, processes aren't completely stable, right? So you need to handle the highs and the lows. And so go add 20% to the size. And I think that's kind of, is our food system, whether it's local or whether it's, global. It's like you need that 20%. But the unfortunate thing is that you have to produce it. But in the way the system is structured right now, the majority of the time that you don't use it, the cost of that, the penalty of that 20% falls back on the farmer, right? Because prices come down. And then, it's, got this tremendous, kind of, cyclic movement, which keeps farmers from being able to really make investments, over the long term that they might need to make to adopt, more sustainable practices, whether it's regenerative ag, whatever you want to call it, like better soil health, even what I like to think about at the farm level is, how do we get, farmers to think about, not just thinking about, what is my yield per acre or per animal, but how do you think about it on an enterprise basis, right? What's the value of the fence row? What's the value of, the creek that runs through my farm in Kentucky and the forests that are there? That I have, my son and daughter-in-law were there earlier this year. It just happened to be like during migration time that I saw 37 species of birds.
Oh, wow.
In one day. And I think they never moved. They were just down there on the farm, and what's the value of that? So we talk about, is food not valued enough? The other piece that's not valued enough are these ecosystem services that farms and farming offers. And we don't train our farmers to think like that. We're just now starting to see some incentives in that space. I have, land that's in a conservation reserve program in Kentucky, which has been, we've been doing for years and years, which says, okay, this is kind of more sensitive land. We get paid not to farm it, and to, treat it in a different way. But, like, how can we shift that mindset from what happens from a, kind of yield standpoint on an acre or an animal to what's that enterprise value?
And there's a couple of really interesting points in that. One is how you mentioned the risk, and essentially the consumer doesn't take a lot of risk because if a product's not on the shelves, they find something else. And even during COVID, no one here in the United States, starved to death. They might have not had the choice they had, but they certainly didn't starve. Whereas the farmer's taking the majority of that risk, and they're not necessarily getting the upside from the risk. The other thing, and I think the EU is quite an interesting example in this, and I'll take, no longer in the EU, but the United Kingdom. And farmers in the UK, people like to drive around the English countryside and see the stone walls and see the lovely hedgerows and have nice small fields and have sheep grazing or cattle grazing in those fields because it feels very, very English. And a lot of the initial subsidies, the subsidies that went into those systems, all the subsidies were through, say, the milk price or the meat price. And so the subsidies were actually distorting the production economics of the system. And the farmers weren't making a lot of money, but the farmers were spending a third or quarter of, or whatever percentage of their time doing countryside management. And it's I guess it's about aligning the economic situation or the economic incentives with the actual work you want done, and also how we can share the risks. Because at the end of the day, the way I see it is, in some ways, the environment's kind of ended up being the overflow for that risk. Farmers have not looked after things because they haven't been able to afford to look after things as much, because that's where the short-term consequences, the year-by-year consequences, are less there, but the decade or century by century consequences are much greater there. And that's all going to flow onto urban environments and the rest of us if we don't get it right. But we can't expect them to take the burden of the risk either.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Some of it is what you said, it's strictly a timing thing. So getting back to that, that 1995, the Australian point about how can a cheap food system ever be wrong, the kind of the French counterpoint to that, the European counterpoint to that is that, people come to France and they love to look at the countryside. So, we value the beautiful countryside, and we pay our farmers to keep the countryside nice, right? And not kind of plow fence row to fence row. So what you brought up is about aligning incentives around, what it is that you want to achieve I think is super, super important to think about, and that it's not just about, that acre or that animal there. But so I was working with a farmers market in Birmingham back a number of years ago, and they were one of the first really brilliant farmers markets in the US, still tremendously brilliant. And they were trying to figure out how to help. It was an area that you had kind of historically Black farmers. as well down in that area of the world. And they were trying to think about, what they could do to, to provide, to support these historically Black farmers. And, they were like talking about creating this market space, more opportunities to come to market. And, my comment to them was, you need to also provide some way to kind of like manage I won't say manage the supply side of it, but, in the sense of control to what's going on the farm, but give farmers another option. Because, the big challenge, right, with farmers that grow for a cash market and, take it to sell on the weekends is like, you get these weather influences, right? If you're growing tomatoes and everybody's growing tomatoes, it's rainy, there's no tomatoes on the market. So if you actually have a tomato, that's very high value, but suddenly like it stops raining, everybody's got tomatoes at the same time. They all come to the market and the price of tomatoes collapses. So I'm like, my advice to to this farmer's market was you need to create like a kitchen to go with it. So farmers can turn these fresh products into something that they can have, kind of more manage the supply across the year, right? If you talk it to a company like Driscoll's, they do the same thing. It's they look at the amount of berries, high quality berries on the market that the market can bear and keep price up, and to at a premium level, as Esprit does the same thing with kiwi fruits, and then it's like, whatever doesn't meet the quality standards and might kind of oversupply, you move it someplace else in the market, or you turn it into a different kind of product that you can, don't have to like push it right now, this minute, to where, you kind of take that risk. But, in Ireland, farmers that grow beef cattle kind of manage it the same way, because many of them, like in Kentucky, tend to be, it's kind of like their part-time job. They're not full-time beef operations. And it's like, well, that's my bank out there. If I need to, if prices aren't good, I won't take it to market. I'll just let it sit out there for a while. If I don't need the money right now, I won't take it to market. So, but if you're a row crop farmer, you don't quite have that, unless you have on-farm storage, you may not quite have that same ability to, to manage that piece.
Definitely.
Farmers need to be better I guess the bottom line of that, farmers need to be better marketers as well of what they're doing. Historically, like, especially in the US, right? Farmers are generalists. And I'm talking about, kind of diversified farmers like in Kentucky, or row crop farmers in there. They're like, they, it's like they take care of the machinery, they grow a crop, they decide whatever, and the things, so they're good at a lot of things, but maybe not like, super expert at all of them. And I think the thing that, often they tend to be maybe the least skilled at is in the marketing piece of it. So they like, growing it, producing it, and getting that yield, but then it's like, when do I actually sell it?
I think that's very spot on. And obviously there's so many jobs on a farm, and especially kids that grow up and then take over a family farm, marketing's not front and center of any of those kitchen table discussions. I think we keep on jumping back to France today, but I think the wine industry is a fascinating example of that, because at the end of the day, whether it's a $3 bottle of wine from somewhere, or a $10,000 bottle of French champagne, at the end of the day, it's fermented grape juice. It's the same stuff.
Yeah.
Tastes differently, but it's fermented grape juice. And it's interesting because from my perspective, people would say I'd never pay $5,000 or $10,000 for a bottle of wine, but they don't actually, or they very rarely doubt that it's not worth that much, that other people will. So there's an assumed value, this huge value variation based on fermented grape juice. And there's stories about the soil or the climate or the history or whatever. But what do you think there's, in terms of the marketing perspective, the rest of the agricultural industries could learn something from the viticulturalists?
Oh, it's so true. That's a great story. For the last, over, something like, 12, 13 years, I've been working with the Irish food industry. And Dave's colleague and I were invited in back in 2010, back when, the Ireland's economic climate was just a disaster, right? Collapse of Celtic Tiger, all of the, huge debts at the financial firms that Ireland had to pay back. And no real indigenous industry other than agriculture, but at the time was very much commodity focused, beef and dairy, but, sold into international markets without any kind of differentiation at all. And not only differentiation, one, it was, produced at high cost because Ireland's an island. So the costs are higher, no matter what. And we heard the story about like two Irish beef producers would go into a supermarket in Germany and they would undercut each other on price. So not only was it like sold as a commodity, it was sold as a commodity that was pushed down to the lowest possible value of it all. And so my colleague and I were asked to come in, and we had this very simple point of view for them. It's like, one, like you got two choices, right? Two strategy choices. We started there. It's like you either have to be a low cost producer, you have to differentiate, right? And brand. You're never going to be a low cost producer, so you better choose this differentiation strategy. The second one is that, you better work together because you're so small as a country. I think I accused them of being a rounding error on Nestle's balance sheet, which they still remember to this day being called that. So you better work together. And, kind of the third one is you need kind of more innovation, more talent in the industry. But if you're going to brand, you have to prove it. And so they're all kind of gathered around. And this was all of the CEOs of the Irish food industry, supported by Board BIO, which is the Irish Food Board, kind of semi-state agency. And we were, having this conversation about, wow, Ireland's so small. How can you brand? There's really nothing there. And so we kind of settled on sustainability, which was just kind of emerging as an attribute. And it's like, wow, but they're so small. And so Irish is the head of Irish distillers at the time. So not wine, but, in the spirits industry, was Alexander Ricard of the Pernod Ricard family. And he had this most important lesson. He said, it's all about marketing scarcity. It's, this is it. So what you talked about, Ash, about, you've got terroir and you've got these other things. It's really all about marketing scarcity. And so, that was always our, the learning we took away from for the Irish food system is it's like, wow, we have to market the scarcity of the resources that Ireland is bringing, which is this, beautiful land and abundant water and, these happy cows that are outside. And, but yet we have to support it with proof. So this Origin Green program, which is still the world, I think it's the first and still, I think, the only national sustainability program in the world that goes all the way through. It's a voluntary program. But yet 95% of Ireland's food and drink exports now go out from Origin Green certification. And, and it was about aligning the supply chain. And so how do you do that? It was like sharing that vision all the way down, getting the processors to agree, getting them to flow it back down to the farmers to get them on board with it, because you really needed to upskill the farmers to do this, and then collecting the data to support that. So you're marketing scarcity, but supported by data. And I think that, is, a little about your wine story, but with a little more teeth to it.
Awesome. I think one of the things that's been constantly reinforced, basically in pretty much every country I've ever worked in, is that the social and cultural challenges are frequently more arduous and complex than the technical challenges. And in terms of what you just described with the Origin Green Island, you needed collaboration between agribusiness, between the farmers. Governments had a role there. There's potentially a role for academics and entrepreneurs in that space. What can we learn, or what can we do differently to better foster that collaboration to, I guess, overcome those cultural challenges?
Oh, yeah. So I think that's exactly the group that we brought together in, under the Origin Green umbrella. And it was really masterful. First of all, there's no silver bullet answer to it, right? So this was an activation process that took 2 years, from basically the conception idea to launch, to get everything ready for it. And the launch then was just basically at the processor level. It wasn't at the consumer level. So one, we had a shared vision that, when we first started talking about that shared vision, that we were basically laughed out of the room by the CEOs of these food companies. But that vision was based on, it was a very commercial vision. And over the course of kind of coming back and continuing to have conversations at a regular basis, committed to at a regular basis, the world was showing signs that like this was actually tremendously relevant to a certain set of consumers and to a certain set of kind of geographies in the world. And by the time we went through this 2-year process of putting this program in place, it went from, wow, this will never happen, right? We can't agree with anybody, right? We're used to competing in global markets, not working together, to, oh my goodness, why couldn't we have this sooner? So you've got the vision, you have a timeline around it that's generous. And then once you got to the processors, they actually had to work down and bring the farmers in. And then the third part, maybe, which was kind of wraps it all together, it was very commercially motivated. It wasn't just like, oh yeah, we're going to go out and save the world. The Earth's going to be a better place. We can meet our climate commitments. That's how relevant is that if you're on the farm? Unless you actually wrap it back today to like, we don't meet our climate commitments, you're going to be like legislated out of business, right? You're going to lose your license to operate, which is the scariest thing to me now. If we don't have these conversations that I'm talking about, that if we don't act as a more coordinated industry level to be able to say, this is our plan, this is why it's relevant, and this is what's going to happen and why it's so important. We look at what's going on with New Zealand and dairy. We look at what's going on in Netherlands with the pork industry, with Denmark with the pork industry. I mean, these are countries that are kind of legislating their way, regulating their way out of things that have been very important to their economies. And what ends up happening then is that you're actually, pushing production to someplace else in the world of where the environmental footprint is worse. And, from that global standpoint, I don't think that's the right answer. I think it's positive. I think this food system, transformation that we need, there's so many pathways out there right now. People are talking about a frequent kind of a colleague of mine in Dublin and I've developed this paper. We call it the 4Ds, like 4 pathways to a sustainable food system, that we hear, right? This is, you're looking, we started out by talking about this, people have different answers to what that means. And the first one, we call it kind of, defend, like it's like, keep doing what we're doing, let's do more with less, right? Let's really push on productivity. Let's, kind of, squeeze more out of, all of our resources, and those resources, you got land, but I think water is even more important, and not, ignoring sustainability commitments, but, using technology, really, kind of pushing forward on that piece of it. And that keeps, very affordable food, it's a kind of a world of more abundance. Second D we talk about is develop, which is like, wow, let's take the system we have and like, let's find some of these things that people might value more. The sustainability commitments, whether it's grass-fed beef, grass-fed dairy, something that's bee friendly, ice cream that's bee friendly, dairy that's raised, with, like think about Danone and their non-GMO approach, even though I think that rhetoric has died down in the US tremendously. And then kind of differentiate that product, right? Go out and find the consumers that, might be willing to pay for it, or maybe you're willing to, more likely buy it versus something else. Pay farmers more, communicate more. It takes more communication and it takes more, high prices at the farm level, or maybe longer term contracts, but certainly more communication in that piece. But yet the two other D's there where it gets interesting, there's a D we call defy, which is like, okay, we want to change the food system, but we're going to change that by changing what people eat. So instead of eating beef, we want you to eat a plant-based burger, right? Instead of eating, another form of protein, we want you to eat insects, or, something that's kind of, but it's really hard to change diets. And we see that now, we had all of so much investment into these spaces. And now we see the performance of, companies like, Beyond and Impossible really, and I think those products are still highly relevant, but they may not be the branded products, the big blast around the brands that we see. there. And then the fourth D is our disrupt model, which is also seeing a lot of investment. And that's where, like, we won't change what you eat, but we're going to change how it's produced. So cultivated meats, precision fermentation, biomass fermentation, maybe even controlled environment ag, right? Let's change how the food itself is raised and, move it into a more capital intensive system, shift the risk on it, make it more like a factory, and basically move away from land-based production. So, and all of those are there. All of those may be viable ways to get to a more sustainable food system. And I think the opportunity is to tackle all of them. But if you're a company, you need to understand where you are and where maybe the opportunities are and where you may be, under threat from. Pat Brown from Impossible says he wants to get, to do away with animal agriculture by 2035. That's a message that a certain group of people are hearing. So you need to respond to that, and, but doesn't mean that you can't continue to push.
Oh, I think firstly, I think all those different innovations and they all have value, and where that value sits and how much. I don't think any of them are silver bullets. I don't think the concept of a silver bullet, I think, is just wrong. And the more people try and look for silver bullets, the more they're likely to go in the wrong direction. And there's a balance that I would see between those different technologies or approaches. And I would see the challenge, I think, is the balance is going to be very different in different geographies or different communities. And that's both within the developing and the developed world.
Yes, that's super, super important, Ash, because people look right now and say, oh yeah, look at these plant-based, proteins, they're really, they're collapsing in the US, right? The market demand's not just stalled, but it's actually falling. But where I look for those kind of products are in Asia. So China, huge need for food security, right? All over Asia, Singapore, 30 by 30, they want to be producing 30% of their own food by 2030. You can already buy a cultivated chicken product in restaurants, and there you can, they're supporting strongly, precision fermentation, cultivated meats, plant-based meats, controlled environment ag. So, we get all caught up, and honestly, I think it's still a little bit of hubris, right? If you're in the US, you think that we are the world leader in technology in, so many spaces. I don't know if that's true anymore. I don't even know if we're relevant anymore between the US and Europe used to control these conversations around food, right? What happened here was important. Today, and into the future, I think you have to look to Asia. And, the investments they're making, investors like, Temasek and New Horizons, Chinese government putting, cultivated meats in their 5-year plan. Those are the things that are going to shape the world of the future, rather than whether the U.S. consumer goes in and buys a Beyond Burger off the supermarket shelf in, whatever supermarket you're shopping at.
Well, between India and China, you've got roughly a third of all the people on the planet. And then there's another third or so almost in Africa, I guess.
Africa,
right. The West, even just obviously West has a big role in many, many ways, but those different geographies will have both huge implications on terms of what gets developed and produced, but also on the ultimate sustainability of any production because of the footprints of those places. And, you do have the fact that a huge percentage of the Indian population is Hindu and vegetarian. And there's great vegetarian food in India. It's easy to go to India and spend a month there and not eat any meat, and you're less likely to have any digestive issues as well. And then China's got a different approach to meat consumption as well. And they've been essentially eating fermented protein in the form of tofu for centuries. So it's a smaller leap from your beef burger here to it goes back to what you were saying when you were talking about sitting around the table and the canning, and then people thinking this is something amazing and new that's never been done before, whereas it's actually not as blue sky as many people would think.
Yeah, completely. So I would keep a strong eye on Asia for technologies like that. I do think they shape, the future of global demand for proteins, in particular, and proteins, of course, shapes the demand for everything else, right? Because of the big, backwards kind of multiplier effect on the food system. So, I think we need it all. So that's the idea, when we have, our 4 boxes in this very simple 2x2 matrix, of, defy, develop, disrupt, and defend. People say, oh, well, typical 2x2, you want to be moving from like defend to defy or something like that. It's like, no, like all of these boxes actually are important. They all need technology. They all need broad adoption, right? And there's certain minimums that are moving up in the world now, as I think as we understand more particularly about the implications of climate right now. So climate is something that's always changing. It's, I can remember different decades over my life that my dad was selling farm equipment. 10 years it was like it rained all the time, and 10 years it was dry all the time, right? And so the equipment you need kind of changes around that. And I think from a breeding standpoint, right, we can breed, we can adapt crops to, to higher temperatures or to, grow with less water and things. Canada is clearly winning in all of this as kind of gets warmer up there. I'm a strong supporter of, farmland purchases in Canada. I think the South, it's gets a bit more challenging around that. But I think it's kind of the variations. It goes back to what we were talking about. How can you have an efficient system when kind of the unreliability of production is a challenge, like a constant challenge?
Is that a mindset? And I guess back in my early days working with dairy farmers in Australia, and this is a slightly simplified example, but there's the guy who fed the animals when they were milking them and they grazed in the paddock. And he had, say, 28 paddocks. And there was the first Monday of the month, the second Monday of the month, and they went round. And if it was the middle of spring and grass was jumping out of the ground, they went round the same speed. And if it was the middle of the winter and there was no grass, they went round the same speed. And this whole concept, the cows and the climate and the grass, they don't care whether it's Sunday and it's the weekend or whether it's Tuesday or whatever. They care about moisture, sunlight, temperature, recent grazing. Yeah. And we have this concept of looking through it through our, human view lens, rather than saying, well, this is actually nature, and all these things that we've made are actually oblivious to that. And do we need to start adapting to their cycles or the natural cycles, rather than being so, especially when it comes to actually production, rather than expecting the natural cycles to adapt to us, which they won't?
Well, I think that's a great point. One of the most insightful comments I've ever heard about farming came when I was visiting a good friend of mine in New Zealand, and she was professor at Massey University, but also she and her husband have what I would have described as a dairy farm. And I was with them, and she said, no, Mary, it's like, we're not dairy farmers. Our job in New Zealand as farmers is to grow grass. Our job is to grow the best crop of grass we can ever grow. And then we make a processing decision. What do we want to turn that grass into? Do we want to turn it into into milk production? Do we want to turn it into, beef, into sheep, into, venison? And I just thought that if you kind of focus on that fundamental, like we want from this soil, this precious, soil and resources we have, to do the best that we can with it, right? And if you're thinking about your job as growing grass, maybe you move that herd in a different rotation, right? In order to keep that grass, right, to where it comes back again. And I think that, kind of comes back to, my view about, we've got to get the focus off of, the, yield per acre per animal back into that enterprise level, right? And kind of like, let's figure out the things that really matter to, whether it's, sustainability, whether that's, profitability, economic viability, social sustainability, others, that kind of that human sustainability piece of it, into what is it that really matters? Is food valuable? Yes, but nutrition is more valuable than food, perhaps, right? So, when we talk about, do we have to value food more? I think we need to, think, again, that stronger, that link between, what a person eats and, their health. The cost in the US today, certainly in my home state of Kentucky, to treat illnesses that are related to poor dietary choices is huge, right? Why don't we move some of that money from treatment into, kind of better foods, better diet? And it's not saying that this food is good and this food is bad. It's like, that combination, again, go back to the idea, what is it? Do we want to be sustainable? Is it just farm or agriculture or food system, or is it a sustainable diet? What does that look like? And how can we get people to, to kind of the way that the funding works in the world, these big pots of money into shifted from this camp into something that is, more, not just preventative in nature, but also gives people a better quality of life, right? It's, kind of this aging. Now as we are getting older, you and I, it's kind of like, you want to age with, something to where you're continue to be active, mentally active, physically active.
I think there's a huge opportunity, given so many of our current health issues are related to metabolic disease and the inflammatory response to metabolic disease, and that also increases the susceptibility to infectious or communicable disease, but also increases susceptibility to things like Alzheimer's and cancers and those sorts of things. And then there's this huge resource, the amount of money that's spent on health, that to deal with these originally food-related diseases and health issues. And if we can decrease the costs to the health system, then that also frees up huge amounts of resources that we could then push back into having more sustainable food systems and energy systems and all those sorts of things. And obviously that's easy to say, but implementation is much more challenging, and there's big hurdles there.
Well, what you said earlier about silos, right? That's a huge challenge on the human health side as well. And I hope those are changing. But I remember when my dad and my mom both went through, severe, illnesses. My dad, kind of a heart condition, COPD, that led to his death, what I would have considered, way too early. And my mom had a particular type of cancer. And, kind of navigating that system is like every person that you met in the kind of the healthcare team, they were thinking about their own little silo, right? So I'm the lung doctor, right? I'm the heart doctor. I'm the person that, like, the infectious disease person. It's like nobody was thinking about that whole enterprise, right? The patient, I was talking to my own GP about it, and she's like, it's so scary, Mary. I'm scared to death of ever being sick, because and so how do we get this, again, just like I'm saying, I want to think about, this, kind of from an enterprise level from the farm. It's like the enterprise level of the person, and that approach that's more, kind of based on, the whole human health approach, as opposed to, we've got these specialties here and they don't necessarily talk to each other, and nobody's really thinking about, a set of long-term outcomes that is, maybe what would be the best for the patient, starting early on, right? As opposed to treating it, at the end of life.
But I think there's a similar mentality in both farming and also in traditional medicine, where you have a disease, or you have an insect pest your crop and you or a weed, you go, okay, I'm going to spray something that will kill that, and it's a very linear, single solution, single problem wrapped up in a nice neat bow. And same with, you've got a disease, and be that a cancer or be that a certain bacterial infection or whatever, and it's the same thing, we're going to go and treat that one issue rather than looking more holistically. So it's this one-to-one rather than we're going to intervene, and we want to have many outcomes that are all working together. And I guess that's about embracing the complexity rather than trying to ignore the complexity and boil it down to something that we can easily conceptualize.
Yeah, that was always my challenge. I studied economics, at a very high level, and I must say it was not a good fit, because I kept accusing economists, who have some of which have gone on now and won like Nobel Prizes, and been like the Council of Economic Advisors or Treasury secretaries in the U.S. Telling them that the problem with economists is they assumed all the complexity away in the world. Therefore, their answers were never relevant, right? And I think that's that piece. That's why I come back, and I really like that answer of my, New Zealand farmer friend, who says, our job is to grow grass, and it's to grow the best crop of grass we can grow it. And, it's just kind of, I think it's hugely complex, right? But it's kind of simple, right? It's a simple answer, but the complexity about growing that wonderful crop of grass, right, and then making a processing decision is, kind of changes where the goalposts are. And I think that's what you're saying as well.
Oh, completely. We've gone on for a while, so we probably should not, keep on going too long, even though we could probably talk for another hour.
I know we could talk for days about this, and your audience might not appreciate that as much as we do.
Is there anything else that we haven't discussed that you think should be mentioned?
I don't know. There's so many things in the world. I think we've covered a lot of them, right? The everything from the need to engage, with consumers to, even consumers. So we need to engage with people, right? The enterprise level approach, this idea about, you need to get, I think that, kind of alignment around a shared vision as an industry, and technology clearly underpins so many of these solutions. I think the one thing I would come back to at the end, this is the most important industry in the world. There's without a doubt, right? And I think the thing that we don't do enough is to make that case for our young people, and why, if they are so concerned about the world and they want to give the world a better future, that they should come and work in this industry, right? And they should work at it in a way that they can, actually achieve scale, that rather than these very, very singular, kind of nice, solutions, but that, may not make. It's like, if you can get, dairy cows in India, where there's, something like 1 billion of them, there's a tremendous number of dairy cows there. I mean, if you can get, 1% improvement in those cows, maybe that's better than focusing on getting a bigger improvement in the US or in Australia, where our herds are already tremendously productive. But so I think it all comes down to talent. I always end everything that I do with that, case, that plea that we need to have, that talent in this industry needs to be absolutely top notch. That means that we'll be able to solve the challenges of the future, and there are many of those. And it's why I've dedicated a certain portion of my career to being in an area, at Harvard Business School, to where you can kind of influence that talent. Through the International, Food and Agribusiness Management Association, where we work around the world to engage, certainly, industry and governments around these important conversations, but also to get, young people excited and to bring them into an industry that, maybe they have thought about, but they didn't realize the potential of, or maybe even they haven't thought about at all. So, I might leave you with that, Ash, and thanks for a hugely interesting conversation.
Mary, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you, and thank you very, very much. A pleasure as always, I should say. So thank you very, very much.
You're welcome.
You've been listening to The Ash Cloud with me, Ash Sweeting, in conversation with Mary Shelman, recorded in California in December 2022.